Look at a map of the world's most dangerous fault lines, and one country sits at nearly all of the lines. It borders a nuclear rival it has fought 4 wars with. It shares a frontier with a nation that has been the graveyard of empires for 2 centuries. It hosts a port that could redraw the flow of global oil. And it holds, by some estimates, over 170 nuclear warheads, controlled by a state whose own internal stability is never fully guaranteed. This is not a country that asked to be important. Geography made the decision before any government did. Every empire that has ever wanted to move an army, a trade route, or an idea between Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East has had to pass through this land or fight to avoid it. The British knew it. The Soviets learned it the hard way. The Americans discovered it twice, a generation apart, in the same mountains. And China is building its future through it right now, pouring billions into a corridor of roads and pipelines that promises to change how the entire region breathes. So why does Pakistan matter so much? Not just to its neighbors, but to Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and every capital in between? Why is a country that has spent much of its history in political turbulence, economic fragility, and military rule remained one of the most courted, feared, and indispensable actors on the world stage? The answer is not simple, and it is not comfortable. It runs through partition and betrayal, through jihad and blowback, through nuclear brinkmanship and quiet diplomacy conducted in rooms no camera ever entered. To understand it, we have to go back to the moment a line was drawn across a map, and a nation was born that the world would never be able to ignore. In August 1947, as the British Empire dismantled its largest colonial possession, a boundary commission led by a lawyer who had never before set foot in India was given weeks to divide a subcontinent of hundreds of millions of people along religious lines. The result was Pakistan, a state carved into 2 wings, separated by 1,000 miles of hostile Indian territory, built on the idea that Muslims of South Asia needed a homeland of their own. From its very first hour, Pakistan's geography was its destiny and its curse. It inherited a western frontier abutting Afghanistan and Iran, a northern edge touching the high passes into Central Asia and China, a long Arabian Sea coastline opening onto the world's busiest oil shipping lanes, and an eastern border with India that would harden, within months, into one of the most militarized frontiers on Earth. The First War came almost immediately. In October 1947, irregular forces backed by Pakistan moved into the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, whose Hindu ruler governed a Muslim-majority population and had not yet acceded to either dominion. India intervened militarily after the rulers signed an instrument of accession, and by the war's end in 1949, Kashmir was divided by a ceasefire line that both nations claimed in full and neither fully controlled. That line has never been resolved. It remains, to this day, one of the most heavily fortified and dangerous borders on the planet, a place where 2 nuclear powers still exchange gunfire. But Kashmir alone does not explain why Pakistan became so strategically vital to outside powers. That transformation began in the 1950s as the Cold War divided the globe into competing blocs. The United States, seeking to contain Soviet influence along the arc from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, needed partners along the southern rim of the communist world. Pakistan, freshly independent and anxious about its much larger neighbor, offered itself as exactly that partner. It joined the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization and the Central Treaty Organization, hosting American reconnaissance operations, including two spy flights launched from Peshawar that photographed deep into Soviet territory, flights that led directly to the 1960 U-2 incident when pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Soviet airspace, having taken off from Pakistani soil. Islamabad's leaders understood the trade they were making. In exchange for military aid, economic assistance, and diplomatic backing against India, Pakistan would lend its geography to the American Cold War effort. That geography grew more valuable, not less, as the decades passed. When Soviet forces crossed into Afghanistan in December 1979 to prop up a faltering communist government, Pakistan's northwest frontier suddenly became the single most important piece of real estate in the entire Cold War. Millions of Afghan refugees poured across the border into Pakistan, and along with them came the infrastructure of a resistance war. The Pakistani government, then under military ruler Mohammad Zia-ul-Haq, positioned itself as the indispensable conduit between the Mujahideen fighting inside Afghanistan and the outside powers arming them, chiefly the United States and Saudi Arabia, with weapons, funds, and training routed through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate. Billions of dollars in covert aid flowed through Peshawar and into the mountains, and an entire generation of fighters, many of them foreign volunteers drawn by the call to jihad, trained in camps on Pakistani soil before crossing into Afghanistan to fight Soviet forces and their Afghan communist allies. The consequences of that decade would not become clear until much later, but the strategic logic was, at the time, straightforward and widely embraced in Washington. Pakistan was the only viable staging ground for bleeding the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and its cooperation was purchased with military hardware, economic packages, and a studied silence about its parallel, secret pursuit of nuclear weapons. That silence itself reveals how strategic value can override other priorities. Pakistan's nuclear program, launched after its catastrophic defeat in the 1971 war with India, a war that saw Pakistan's eastern wing break away entirely to become the independent nation of Bangladesh, proceeded through the 1980s with only muted international objection, precisely because Washington needed Islamabad's cooperation against Moscow more than it wanted to police proliferation. Pakistan conducted its first confirmed nuclear tests in 1998, becoming the seventh nation to openly demonstrate nuclear weapons capability, and doing so within weeks of India's own tests. A reminder that Pakistan's nuclear program has never existed in isolation. It exists because of India, is calibrated against India, and is defended domestically almost entirely in terms of the existential threat Pakistani planners believe India poses. This is the second pillar of Pakistan's strategic importance. It is one of only 9 nuclear-armed states in the world, and the only one whose primary rival is also a nuclear-armed neighbor, sharing a live, contested border. Every crisis between India and Pakistan since 1998, the Kargil conflict of 1999, the 2001 Parliament attack crisis, the 2008 Mumbai attacks, and the 2019 Balakot airstrikes and aerial dogfight, has carried with it the latent possibility of nuclear escalation. Analysts and military planners in Washington, Beijing, and beyond have spent decades studying command and control safeguards on both sides, precisely because a miscalculation in Kashmir carries consequences that could reach far beyond South Asia. No other bilateral relationship on Earth combines nuclear weapons, an unresolved territorial dispute, and a decades-long history of direct combat in quite the same way. Then came the moment that reoriented Pakistan's strategic value once again. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the United States needed a partner for the invasion of Afghanistan to remove the Taliban government sheltering al-Qaeda. Pakistan, under military ruler Pervez Musharraf, agreed, under significant American pressure, to grant overflight rights, logistical support, and intelligence cooperation, becoming a frontline state in the war on terror. Karachi's port and the overland routes through Pakistan became the supply artery for American and NATO forces in landlocked Afghanistan for the better part of 2 decades, a logistics dependency so significant that entire military campaigns were shaped by the terms Islamabad set for truck convoys crossing the Khyber Pass. Yet the same Pakistani security establishment that facilitated the American war also maintained links, tolerated by parts of its intelligence apparatus, with elements of the Afghan Taliban and allied militant networks. A double game that generated bitter recrimination in Washington, even as both governments remained locked in mutual dependence. American officials accused Pakistan of playing both sides. Pakistani officials countered that they were absorbing the war's costs disproportionately, citing tens of thousands of Pakistani soldiers and civilians killed in the domestic insurgency the Afghan war spilled across the border, particularly in the tribal regions along the frontier and in cities battered by a homegrown Pakistani Taliban movement that turned its guns on the state that had once tolerated militancy as a tool of regional policy. This history matters because it reveals a pattern that defines Pakistan's geopolitical role across 75 years. It is a country whose location makes it indispensable to whichever great power is contesting Afghanistan or the wider region. And that indispensability has repeatedly allowed Islamabad to extract resources, aid, and strategic tolerance even while pursuing policies, nuclear proliferation, support for militant proxies, contested relations with India that would otherwise invite far greater international isolation. Pakistan has, in effect, monetized its geography for 7 decades. That geography is expanding in significance again today, not through war, but through infrastructure. Since 2015, China has invested tens of billions of dollars in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a network of highways, railways, power plants, and industrial zones running from Xinjiang in China's far west down through Pakistan to the deep water port of Gwadar on the Arabian Sea. For Beijing, the strategic logic is profound. China's energy imports overwhelmingly transit the Strait of Malacca, a choke point that Chinese strategists have long worried could be blockaded by a hostile navy in any future conflict. A functioning overland corridor through Pakistan to Gwadar offers China an alternative route for oil and goods that bypasses that vulnerability entirely, connecting Western China directly to the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean without a single ship needing to pass through Southeast Asian waters. Gwadar itself, though still limited in throughput today, has become a symbol of a broader contest. India, the United States, and other regional powers watch closely for signs that the port could one day host Chinese naval assets, extending Beijing's reach directly into waters that India has long considered its own strategic backyard. Pakistan's relationship with China, in fact, is often described in Islamabad as an all-weather friendship, a phrase repeated so often in official rhetoric that it has become shorthand for the country's most reliable strategic partnership. One forged in part because both nations share a wary relationship with India, and because China, unlike the United States, has offered military and economic support with far fewer public conditions attached regarding governance, human rights, or nuclear policy. For Pakistan, the corridor represents an opportunity to diversify away from a historically volatile relationship with Washington, which has cooled and warmed repeatedly depending on the immediate needs of American-Afghan policy. For China, it represents a foothold at the crossroads of South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East, and a hedge against maritime vulnerabilities that could prove decisive in any future great power confrontation. None of this exists apart from Pakistan's internal reality, which has itself become a strategic variable that outside powers must constantly assess. The country has cycled between civilian governments and direct military rule multiple times since independence, with the army retaining, even under civilian administrations, decisive influence over foreign policy, nuclear command, and relations with India and Afghanistan. Economic fragility has been a near-constant companion, with Pakistan repeatedly turning to the International Monetary Fund for balance of payment support. More than 20 programs since the 1950s, a dependency that gives international financial institutions, and by extension the major economies that dominate them, real leverage over Pakistani policy. Add to this a population that has crossed 240 million people, one of the largest in the world, young, rapidly urbanizing, and increasingly vulnerable to water scarcity and climate stress in the Indus Basin that sustains its agriculture. And Pakistan's stability becomes not a domestic curiosity, but a matter of direct concern to neighbors and distant powers alike. A Pakistan that fractures, defaults, or loses control of its nuclear arsenal is a nightmare scenario discussed seriously in defense ministries far beyond South Asia. The turning point in how the world has come to weigh all of this arrived gradually rather than in a single dramatic event, but it crystallized after the American withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021. With the Taliban's return to power in Kabul, the very insurgency Pakistan had once been accused of nurturing found itself governing next door, and Islamabad discovered that a friendly Taliban government did not translate into a quiet border. The Pakistani Taliban, operating from sanctuaries the Afghan Taliban has been reluctant to dismantle, escalated attacks inside Pakistan itself, forcing Islamabad into military operations and diplomatic disputes with the very movement it had long been accused of sponsoring. The relationship that had once been Pakistan's greatest strategic asset, its unique access to and influence over Afghan affairs, had curdled into one of its most persistent security threats, illustrating how quickly the logic of proxy support can turn back on the state that wielded it. At the same time, the broader strategic map has shifted around Pakistan once more, as Washington's attention pivots increasingly toward great power competition with China, and as India has emerged as a Central American partner in that contest, through frameworks like the Quad alongside Japan and Australia. Pakistan's old Cold War role as America's frontline partner has diminished, even as its importance to China has grown in direct proportion. Islamabad today finds itself navigating a far more complicated balancing act than at any point in its Cold War history. Courted by Beijing, needed occasionally by Washington for counterterrorism cooperation and Afghan diplomacy, locked in permanent strategic competition with New Delhi, and dependent on Gulf states and international lenders to keep its economy afloat. Every one of these relationships intersects with the others. A closer Pakistan-China relationship complicates Washington's calculations. A warmer Pakistan-India relationship would be the single most stabilizing development in South Asian security and remains, after 8 decades, elusive. The consequences of Pakistan's strategic position are visible in nearly every major regional and global security discussion of the 21st century. In discussions of nuclear risk, Pakistan is a central case study, both because of the India rivalry and because of long-standing international concern dating back to the revelations surrounding the network run by nuclear scientist Abdul Qadir Khan in the early 2000s, about the security of Pakistani nuclear technology and materials. In discussions of counterterrorism, Pakistan remains central to any accounting of al-Qaeda's history. Osama bin Laden was found and killed by American forces in a compound in Abbottabad, well within Pakistani territory, in May 2011. An operation conducted without Pakistani government knowledge that badly strained the alliance and raised uncomfortable questions that were never fully resolved about what elements of the Pakistani state may have known. In discussions of belt and road infrastructure and maritime strategy, Pakistan is China's most significant partner outside its own borders. In discussions of climate and water security, the Indus River system that Pakistan depends on for the overwhelming majority of its agriculture is governed by a treaty with India dating to 1960, one that has come under new strain as climate change and political tension have led to talk on the Indian side of reconsidering its terms, a development that Pakistani officials have described in the starkest possible terms. Given that water security is, for a country of Pakistan's size and agricultural dependency, inseparable from national survival. Reflecting on all of this, what emerges is not a story of a country that sought power through conquest or ideology, but of a state whose geography placed it permanently at the intersection of every major contest of the modern era. The Cold War standoff between Washington and Moscow, the jihad against Soviet occupation in Afghanistan, the post-9/11 war on terror, the nuclear rivalry with India, and now the 21st century competition between the United States and China for influence across Asia. Pakistan did not choose to sit at all of these crossroads simultaneously. But having found itself there, it has, across 7 decades of political upheaval, economic hardship, and military governance, consistently managed to convert its location into leverage, extracting aid, arms, and diplomatic tolerance from great powers who could not afford to lose access to its territory. That is precisely why the question of Pakistan's stability is never merely a domestic Pakistani matter. It is a question that touches the security calculations of Washington and Beijing, the nuclear anxieties of New Delhi, the future of Afghan governance in Kabul, the flow of Gulf oil through waters Pakistan's coastline borders, and the fate of one of the largest nuclear arsenals outside the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states. Empires rose and fell trying to control the routes that cross this land. States and superpowers have spent fortunes courting whoever governs it. And as new rivalries take shape in the decades ahead, the mountains, rivers, and coastline that define Pakistan's borders will almost certainly matter again. Because in the geography of global power, some crossroads never stop being crossed.